The grand hall of the prestigious university buzzed with excitement, its high ceilings echoing the laughter and chatter of students and esteemed guests alike. Dressed in an elegant navy dress that complemented her determined spirit, Julia Hart stood to the side, observing the mingling crowd. This was a world of privilege, one that felt foreign to her, yet she was determined to carve her own place within it. As she clutched her drink tightly, she spotted him across the room, Richard Blackwell, the billionaire heir, effortlessly charming the crowd with his charismatic smile and polished demeanor. He was surrounded by admirers, his confident laughter mingling with the clinking of champagne glasses. Julia's heart raced. She had read about him in the papers, his family name synonymous with wealth and power. But today, in this shimmering light, he was more than just a name. He was a living embodiment of everything she aspired to challenge. "Can you believe he's here?" whispered a fellow student, Sarah, nudging Julia and nodding in Richard's direction. "I heard he's going to speak later. They say he can charm anyone." "Charming or not, it doesn't mean he's right," Julia replied, her voice steady, though she felt a knot forming in her stomach. The air was thick with ambition, and she could almost taste the bitterness of her own dreams colliding with the harsh reality of the world around her. As if sensing her gaze, Richard turned, his eyes locking onto hers for a brief, electrifying moment. Julia's breath caught in her throat, and she quickly looked away, feeling a flush creep up her cheeks. She had spent years preparing for this moment, honing her skills and building her dreams, yet the thought of confronting him sent tremors of doubt through her. "Julia? Come on, let's go introduce ourselves," Sarah urged, pulling her gently toward the crowd. Before she could protest, Julia found herself standing before Richard, who was now engaging with a small group of admirers. She felt small and insignificant, yet a fire ignited within her. This was her chance to make an impression, to challenge the very ideals he personified. "Richard Blackwell," he said, extending his hand with an air of nonchalance that suggested he had already forgotten the names of the people he had just met. "And you are?" "Julia Hart," she replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm studying law here." "Ah, future lawyer," he said, his tone dismissive, as if he were handing out a token acknowledgement rather than engaging in a meaningful conversation. "What do you plan to do with that? Join a big firm and chase the dollar?" His words hit her like a slap. She could feel the collective breath of the group around them, their eyes shifting between her and Richard, waiting for her reaction. In that moment, she realized he saw her not as an equal but as a stepping stone, a mere footnote to his narrative of success. "I plan to fight for justice," Julia shot back, surprising even herself with the boldness of her reply. "Not everyone is driven by money, Mr. Blackwell." He raised an eyebrow, amusement flickering across his features. "Justice? In corporate law? You'll soon learn that the game is rigged, Julia. It's a dog-eat-dog world. You either play by the rules or get left behind." The laughter of the group faded, leaving an uncomfortable silence in its wake. Julia could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, but she refused to back down. "Then I guess it's time for someone to change the rules," she replied, her determination bubbling beneath the surface. Richard studied her for a moment, a glimmer of respect, or perhaps curiosity, crossing his face. "Good luck with that," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "You'll need it. Just remember, the higher you climb, the harder you fall." With that, he turned back to the group, leaving Julia standing there, her heart pounding in her chest. As she walked away, she felt a mix of humiliation and anger bubbling inside her, igniting a fire that would shape her future. She would prove him wrong. She would rise, no matter how many obstacles lay in her path. The years that followed were a blur of late nights and relentless determination. Julia remembered those lonely nights in her cramped apartment, surrounded by stacks of textbooks and the relentless hum of her laptop. The small kitchen was littered with takeout containers, her only source of sustenance on the nights she worked long into the early hours. Between classes and studying, she balanced multiple jobs, each one more exhausting than the last. She worked as a waitress at a local diner, her feet aching by the end of the shift, and as a research assistant for a professor who rarely acknowledged her efforts. Sometimes, she would sit in the library until the doors closed, poring over case studies and legal precedents, her mind racing with thoughts of how she would dismantle the very empire Richard Blackwell represented. Each hour spent preparing was a step closer to her goal, but the journey was far from easy. The stark contrast between her life and Richard's weighed heavily on her. He flaunted his wealth and privilege, attending lavish parties and traveling the world while she struggled to make ends meet. Julia often found herself scrolling through social media, watching as Richard posted pictures from exotic locations, his life a stark reminder of the chasm between them. "Why do you even look at that?" her friend Sarah would ask, concern etching her features as Julia sat on the couch, staring at her screen. He's not worth it. It's not about him, Julia insisted, though deep down, she knew it was. It's about what he represents. I can't let him win. Just remember to take care of yourself too, Sarah would say, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. You can't fight the world if you're running on empty. But Julia pushed through, each sleepless night only fueling her resolve. She would channel every ounce of her pain and frustration into her studies, knowing that one day, she would stand in the courtroom, representing those who had been silenced by the likes of Richard Blackwell. Years later, the day finally arrived. Julia stood in her cap and gown, her heart racing with pride and anticipation. As she looked around at her classmates, many of whom were heading to prestigious firms, she felt a sense of belonging she had longed for. She had done it. She was graduating at the top of her class. As the valedictorian, she took to the stage, her heart pounding as she faced the crowd. She could see familiar faces in the audience, friends, professors, and even her family, who had sacrificed so much for her education. But her gaze drifted, and for a fleeting moment, she imagined Richard sitting there among them, his smirk and dismissive words ringing in her ears. Today is not just a celebration of our achievements, she began, her voice steady and clear. It's a testament to our resilience, our determination to stand up against the odds. We are the architects of our futures, and I promise to use my knowledge not just for personal gain, but to fight for those whose voices have been silenced. The applause that followed filled her with hope, and as she stepped down from the stage, she felt the weight of her ambitions settle firmly on her shoulders. She would take down Richard Blackwell, not only for herself but for everyone who had been underestimated, overlooked, or silenced. With each step she took away from the podium, Julia felt a sense of purpose solidifying within her. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but she was ready to face them head-on. She was no longer the young woman who had trembled in Richard's presence. She was an attorney with a mission. As she left the ceremony, her phone buzzed in her pocket. A notification popped up, a news article about Richard Blackwell and his company, Blackwell Enterprises. Julia paused, her heart racing. The headline promised to reveal the secrets behind his success, the very secrets she was prepared to uncover. With a determined smile, she glanced up at the horizon. This was just the beginning. She had a battle to fight, and victory would be hers. Julia Hart sat at her sleek glass-top desk, the hum of the bustling law firm around her a stark contrast to the chaotic thoughts swirling in her mind. As a newly minted attorney at Thorne & Associates, she had made a name for herself quickly, but the specter of Richard Blackwell loomed larger than ever. She had spent years plotting her revenge against the billionaire who had once humiliated her, and now, she was finally in a position to begin dismantling his empire. On her first day, she had overheard colleagues discussing Blackwell Enterprises during a meeting. The firm had recently secured a high-profile case involving allegations of unethical practices against the company. Julia's heart raced as she leaned forward, straining to catch every word. She learned about the questionable labor practices, the environmental violations, and a string of lawsuits that had quietly been settled out of court. It was all too familiar, the same ruthless tactics she had witnessed in college, the same disregard for the little people. "Do you really think they'll get him?" one of the partners had asked, a hint of skepticism in his voice. "I don't know," another replied. "He always seems to find a way out. He has the best lawyers money can buy." The frustration bubbled within Julia. She knew she needed to act quickly. Every day spent in the firm was an opportunity to gather evidence, to network, to build a case against Blackwell. But lurking beneath her determination was a nagging question. Was she seeking revenge, or was she truly fighting for justice? Later that week, Julia attended a networking event hosted by the firm. It was a lavish affair, filled with the city's elite, many of whom had ties to Blackwell Enterprises. The venue was a luxurious hotel ballroom, adorned with crystal chandeliers and decadent floral arrangements. As she mingled with attendees, she couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider, despite her new title. "Julia, right?" A voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find Sarah, one of the senior associates, standing beside her. "Yeah, that's me," Julia replied, forcing a smile. "I've heard good things about you," Sarah said, her tone cordial but her eyes assessing. "But I've also heard you've taken an interest in Blackwell. Just be careful, okay? That man doesn't play by the rules." Julia felt a rush of indignation at the warning. "I can handle myself," she said firmly. "I'm not afraid of Richard Blackwell." "Fear isn't the issue," Sarah replied, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "It's the consequences. He has a way of making people disappear, figuratively speaking, of course. His connections run deep. Julia glanced around the room, her resolve hardening. She had spent too long cowering in the shadows, and she refused to let fear dictate her actions now. I appreciate the advice, but I know what I'm doing. As the evening wore on, Julia found herself in conversation after conversation with potential allies and foes alike, all while keeping a mental checklist of the information gleaned about Blackwell Enterprises. The more she learned, the more her anger simmered beneath the surface. Each new detail she uncovered only fueled her desire to take him down. Weeks passed, and Julia began to piece together a plan. She spent late nights scanning through documents, identifying patterns of exploitation within Blackwell's company. With every violation she discovered, her motivation shifted. It was no longer just about revenge. It was about standing up for those who had been wronged, those who had suffered at the hands of a man who believed he was untouchable. "Hey, Julia," a familiar voice broke her concentration. It was Mark, a fellow associate who had been working closely with her on various cases. "You've been burning the midnight oil lately. You okay?" Julia looked up from her papers, her eyes weary but determined. "I'm fine, just busy." "Busy with what?" Mark pressed, a hint of concern in his tone. "I've seen you going down the rabbit hole with Blackwell. You know he's not someone you want to mess with, right?" Julia straightened, her heart racing at the thought of revealing her true motives. "I'm just gathering information for the firm. We need to be prepared if we're going to take on his company." Mark studied her for a moment, as if trying to gauge her sincerity. "Just be careful. I've heard rumors about him. People who've crossed him, well, let's just say they don't last long in this industry." The warning hung heavily in the air, but Julia felt a fierce determination rising within her. "I can't back down now. Not after everything he put me through." Mark's expression softened, and he nodded slowly. "I get that. Just remember that the law is as much about strategy as it is about justice. Don't let your emotions cloud your judgment." Julia appreciated the advice, but she couldn't shake the memories of her past with Richard, the way he had belittled her ambitions, the laughter of his friends ringing in her ears. She was no longer that insecure young woman. She was a force to be reckoned with. As the days turned into weeks, Julia's investigation deepened. She reached out to former employees of Blackwell Enterprises, gathering testimonies and documents that painted a damning picture of the billionaire's operations. She learned about the unethical labor practices that exploited vulnerable workers, the environmental violations that caused untold harm, and the lengths to which Richard would go to protect his empire. One afternoon, while sifting through a pile of legal documents in the firm's library, Julia stumbled upon a report that made her heart race. It was an internal audit that outlined numerous violations, but it had been buried under a mountain of paperwork. The implications were enormous, and Julia knew it could be the key to her case against Blackwell. "Julia, are you in here?" Sarah's voice called from the doorway. "Yeah, just a second," Julia replied, quickly tucking the report into her folder. She didn't want to share her find just yet. It was too crucial to her plan. Sarah entered, her expression serious. "I've been hearing some chatter around the office. People are worried about you taking this on. I think you should reconsider." "Why? Because he's a billionaire? Because he's powerful?" Julia shot back, her frustration bubbling over. "I'm not afraid of him." "It's not just about fear," Sarah countered, crossing her arms. "It's about the potential fallout. Think about your career, your future. Is this really worth it?" Julia felt a swell of defiance. "Yes, it is. I won't let him get away with what he's done. I refuse to be silenced." Sarah's jaw tightened, and she stepped closer. "I understand your anger, but don't let it cloud your judgment. You're talented, Julia. Don't throw it all away on a vendetta." With that, Sarah turned and left, leaving Julia alone with her thoughts. As she stared at the documents before her, she realized the weight of her choices. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for countless others who had been wronged by Richard Blackwell. In that moment, Julia understood that her journey was about more than just revenge. It was about justice, about making a stand against the very injustices that had fueled her fire. She would bring Richard down, not just for herself, but for everyone who had suffered in silence. And as she prepared to take the next step in her quest, Julia felt the flicker of hope within her, a determination that would not waver, no matter the cost. Julia Hart stood at the entrance of the grand ballroom, the shimmering chandeliers casting a warm glow over the sea of elegantly dressed guests. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and the low hum of polite conversation. Despite the opulence surrounding her, Julia felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. This was no ordinary charity gala. It was a meticulously crafted facade, a stage for Richard Blackwell to wield his charisma and charm while cloaked in the guise of philanthropy. She adjusted the hem of her sleek black dress, a bold choice that mirrored her intentions for the evening. Julia had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, not just with her attire, but with her mind. This gala was her opportunity to confront the man who had once dismissed her dreams and humiliated her in front of her peers. The memory of that day still burned bright in her mind, igniting her ambition and determination for revenge. As she moved through the crowd, she caught glimpses of Richard mingling effortlessly with his guests. He was a tall man, commanding attention with his confident posture and disarming smile. His laughter rang out like music, enchanting those around him, creating an illusion of warmth that masked the ruthless businessman beneath. Julia's heart raced as she recalled the countless nights she had spent studying his every move, unraveling the threads of his empire built on exploitation and deceit. "Julia! Over here!" A familiar voice called out, snapping her back to the present. It was Sarah, a colleague from the law firm, waving enthusiastically from across the room. Julia forced a smile and made her way towards her friend, grateful for a momentary distraction from her thoughts. "You look stunning," Sarah exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with admiration. "Are you ready for this?" Julia hesitated for a moment, her resolve wavering under the weight of her emotions. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I just need to gather some information." Sarah nodded knowingly, her expression shifting to one of concern. "Just be careful, okay? You know how powerful he is. Don't underestimate him." "I won't. I'm here for a reason," Julia assured her, her determination rekindled. With a final exchange of encouragement, she stepped away from Sarah, her focus shifting back to Richard. The music shifted to a softer melody, and Julia seized the opportunity to navigate closer to where Richard was holding court. She observed him from a distance, noting how he effortlessly captivated his audience with stories of his philanthropic endeavors, of the lives he claimed to have changed, all while hiding the darker truths behind his success. She felt a surge of anger boiling beneath her calm exterior. She knew the reality was far more sinister. As she inched closer, Julia overheard snippets of conversation that made her pulse quicken. A group of guests nearby discussed a recent project Richard had funded, a supposed initiative to help the underprivileged. But as their words unfolded, a different narrative emerged. "I can't believe he got away with it," a woman whispered, her voice laced with disbelief. "The layoffs were brutal. He just swept them under the rug like they were nothing." "Exactly. And now he's trying to play the hero," a man chimed in, shaking his head. "It's all a facade. He's just using those donations as a tax write-off." Julia's heart raced as she strained to listen, piecing together the fragments of the conversation. The dark secret hinted at the foundation of Richard's empire was far from the benevolent image he projected. This was the evidence she needed, testimonies from those who had experienced his ruthless tactics firsthand. Determined to learn more, she subtly maneuvered through the crowd, her eyes scanning for any opportunity to gather further intel. Just then, she spotted Richard stepping away from his entourage, heading towards the bar. This was her chance. "Richard," she called out, her voice steady despite the tremor of her nerves. He turned, surprise flickering across his handsome features as he recognized her. "Julia Hart," he said, a sly smile creeping onto his lips. "What a pleasant surprise. I didn't expect to see you here." "Is it?" she replied, her tone icy. "I'm actually here to discuss something quite important." Richard's smile widened, but there was a glimmer of something darker in his eyes. "I'm always open to conversation, especially with old friends. What's on your mind?" Julia stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "I know about your company's practices, Richard. The layoffs, the exploitation. People are suffering because of you." He chuckled lightly, dismissing her words as if they were nothing more than an annoying fly buzzing around his ear. "You've always been so dramatic, Julia. Business is business. You should know that by now." "Business at the expense of others is not something I will accept," she shot back, her voice rising slightly. "You can continue to play the philanthropic billionaire, but I see through your lies." "Lies?" He raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "I'm providing jobs, funding initiatives. What more do you want?" "I want the truth," Julia insisted, her resolve hardening. And I'll make sure everyone knows it." Richard's expression shifted, and for the first time, Julia glimpsed the man beneath the polished exterior. "Careful, Julia. You're treading in dangerous waters," he warned, his voice low and threatening. Julia held her ground, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm not afraid of you, Richard. You may have power, but I have the law on my side." With a dismissive wave, Richard turned back towards the crowd, leaving Julia standing there, her heart racing and her mind racing even faster. Their exchange had only fueled her fire, igniting a fierce determination within her. This was just the beginning. As the gala continued around her, Julia felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just a victim of Richard's cruelty. She was a force to be reckoned with. The whispers she had overheard just moments before echoed in her mind, and she knew she had to dig deeper. There was a network of people who had suffered under Richard's regime, and she would find them. Her thoughts spun with ideas and strategies as she made her way back to Sarah, who was still engaged in conversation with other guests. Julia's mind raced with the possibilities, her heart pounding with excitement. She would uncover the truth, expose Richard's facade, and fight for those who had been silenced. "Did you talk to him?" Sarah asked, her enthusiasm palpable as Julia approached. "I did," Julia replied, her expression fierce. "And I think I've found a way to take him down. But I need more information, more testimonies. We can't let him hide behind his wealth any longer." "Are you sure you want to do this?" Sarah asked, concern etched on her face. "He's dangerous." "I know what I'm getting into," Julia stated firmly, her voice unwavering. "This isn't just about revenge anymore. It's about justice." As the evening wore on, Julia felt a sense of clarity wash over her. She was no longer a young woman haunted by humiliation. She was a determined attorney ready to dismantle a corrupt empire. And she would stop at nothing to ensure that Richard Blackwell faced the consequences of his actions. Julia Hart sat in her office, surrounded by stacks of legal documents and case files. The sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting a warm glow on the polished wooden desk. The walls, adorned with framed diplomas and accolades, bore witness to her journey from a naive college student to a formidable attorney. Yet, despite her achievements, a pervasive tension hung in the air as she prepared to present her lawsuit against Blackwell Enterprises. Her heart raced as she organized her materials, the weight of her mission pressing heavily upon her shoulders. This was not just another case, it was personal. She could still hear Richard Blackwell's condescending laughter echoing in her mind, a haunting reminder of the humiliation she endured years ago. Determined, Julia took a deep breath and straightened her posture. She was ready. "Are you sure about this, Julia?" Mark, her supervising partner, asked as he entered the office, concern etched across his face. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, studying her with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the nerves swirling within her. "Richard's empire is built on exploitation, and it's time someone holds him accountable." Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I get that, but you're aware of the risks, right? His legal team is ruthless. They won't hesitate to bury you if you give them the chance." Julia met his gaze, her determination unwavering. "I'm not backing down. This isn't just about the lawsuit, it's about justice for all the people he's hurt. If I don't fight this battle, who will?" He nodded slowly, respect replacing his initial fear. "All right, let's do this. But we need to tread carefully. I'll support you, but you have to promise me you'll be cautious." Julia smiled, grateful for his support. "I promise. I've done my research and gathered enough evidence to make a solid case. All we need to do is present it." As they settled into the conference room, Julia began detailing her findings, laying out the web of unethical practices that Blackwell Enterprises had woven over the years. The room was filled with her colleagues, each one listening intently as she spoke passionately about the exploitation of workers, the environmental violations, and the shady financial dealings that Richard had used to amass his wealth. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a chart on the projector screen. "These numbers don't lie. Blackwell Enterprises has systematically underpaid its workers while inflating profits for its executives. This isn't just a business model, it's a crime against society." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, and she could see the gears turning in her colleagues' minds. They were beginning to see the gravity of the situation. "Julia, this is compelling," said Sarah, a junior associate who had been quietly observing. "But if Richard finds out we're pursuing this, he'll come after us with everything he has." Are we ready for that? Ready or not, we have to take a stand, Julia asserted, her voice rising with conviction. This isn't just about me, it's about everyone who has been affected by his greed. We owe it to them to fight back. As the discussion continued, Julia felt a surge of hope. Her firm was beginning to rally behind her, and for the first time, she sensed the possibility of real change. Yet, lurking in the back of her mind was the specter of Richard's power and the lengths he would go to protect his empire. Days turned into weeks, and the lawsuit against Blackwell Enterprises gradually gained traction. However, with that momentum came a wave of intimidation tactics from Richard's legal team. Julia could feel the pressure mounting as they attempted to undermine her credibility and dissuade her from pursuing the case. One evening, as she was leaving the office, Julia found a note slipped under her door. It was typed without any identifying information. Drop the lawsuit or you'll regret it. She felt her heart race as she read the words, a chill running down her spine. It was a stark reminder of the power Richard wielded and the lengths he'd go to maintain it. The following day, Mark called an emergency meeting to address the threats. We need to be vigilant, he said, his voice grave as he surveyed the anxious faces around the table. Richard's team is likely to escalate their tactics. We must prepare ourselves for anything. Julia raised her hand, her voice steady. I'm not afraid of their threats. They're trying to intimidate us, but we can't let them win. We have to stay focused on the facts and the evidence we've gathered. Easier said than done, one of the senior partners interjected. Richard Blackwell doesn't play by the rules. He'll do whatever it takes to protect his interests. Julia's resolve hardened. If we back down now, we're only giving him more power. We owe it to the people affected by his actions to see this through, no matter the cost. As the meeting concluded, Julia felt a mix of determination and trepidation. She was prepared for the fight ahead, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. Just when Julia thought the pressure couldn't get any worse, she received an unexpected phone call late one night. The voice on the other end was shaky but familiar. Julia, it's me, Lisa. I worked at Blackwell Enterprises a few years ago. I have information that you need. Julia's heart raced. Lisa had been a former employee who had left the company under mysterious circumstances. What do you have? She asked, her mind racing with possibilities. There's something you don't know about Richard, something that could change everything, Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. Meet me tomorrow at the coffee shop on 5th. It's urgent. The next day, Julia arrived at the cafe early, nerves churning in her stomach. She spotted Lisa sitting at a corner table, her eyes darting around as if she were afraid of being seen. Julia approached cautiously, taking a seat across from her. Thank you for meeting me, Julia said, trying to keep her voice calm. What do you have for me? Lisa glanced around again before leaning in. I have documents, evidence that Richard has been involved in more than just corporate malfeasance. He's been connected to some illegal activities that could bring his whole empire down. Julia's breath caught in her throat. What kind of activities? It's about his dealings with suppliers and how he's been laundering money through shell companies. I have names, dates, everything you need to take him down, Lisa said, her voice trembling with urgency. Why are you telling me this? Julia asked, skepticism creeping into her mind. What's in it for you? Lisa looked down, her fingers fidgeting with the coffee cup. I left the company because I couldn't live with what they were doing. I've been living in fear ever since. I want to help you. If it means bringing Richard to justice, I'll do whatever it takes. Julia studied Lisa's face, sensing the sincerity in her words. This was the break she needed. If you have the documents, we can use them as leverage. But you need to be careful. Richard will go to great lengths to protect his secrets. I know, Lisa replied, determination filling her eyes. But I'm ready to face him. Let's put an end to this. As they exchanged information, Julia felt a surge of hope. The battle against Richard Blackwell was far from over, but now she had a powerful ally and crucial evidence that could turn the tide in her favor. The stakes were higher than ever, and she was more determined than ever to see this through to the end. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Julia Hart sat at the plaintiff's table, her heart racing in her chest. The air was thick with anticipation, every eye in the room trained on her. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders, a mixture of fear and determination swirling within her. Over the past few weeks, as the trial against Richard Blackwell progressed, moments of doubt began to creep into her mind. Was this fight truly worth the cost? The glimmers of revenge that once shone so brightly in her aspirations had begun to dim, overshadowed by the reality of the emotional toll it was taking on her. Julia glanced at Richard, who sat at the defense table, exuding an air of confidence that was almost infuriating. He leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips as he whispered something to his attorney, who chuckled in response. The sight of his arrogance ignited a flicker of resolve within her, but it was quickly followed by the haunting memories of her past, the humiliating dismissal, the loneliness of her college years, and the sacrifices she made to get to this point. Her mind wandered to her childhood, to nights spent studying while her friends went out, to the feeling of being an outsider looking in. Julia had fought tooth and nail for her place in the world, and now here she was, facing the very man who had once belittled her dreams. But the deeper she delved into the case, the more she realized that this was not just about revenge. It was about justice for all those who had suffered at the hands of Richard Blackwell and his empire. "Miss Hart, are you ready to call your next witness?" The judge's voice broke through her reverie, pulling her back to the present. She nodded, swallowing hard as she stood, smoothing her skirt as she approached the witness stand. "Your Honor, I would like to call Mr. Samuel Jenkins to the stand," she announced, her voice steady despite the chaos inside her mind. As Samuel took the stand, Julia's heart raced. He was a former employee of Blackwell Enterprises, and she had spent countless hours preparing him for this moment. His testimony was crucial. It could potentially expose the unethical practices that had been hidden behind the veil of Richard's corporate success. She settled herself, ready to guide him through the questioning. "Mr. Jenkins, please describe your role at Blackwell Enterprises," she began, her tone professional yet warm. "I was a project manager for 5 years," Samuel replied, his voice steady but tinged with the nervousness of being in a courtroom. "I oversaw several high-profile projects, and during that time, I witnessed many unethical practices that I couldn't align myself with." Julia nodded, encouraging him. "Can you elaborate on what you observed?" "There were numerous instances where corners were cut. Safety protocols were ignored to save money. I remember one project in particular where we were pressured to overlook serious safety violations. It was a disaster waiting to happen," Samuel said, his eyes darting toward Richard, whose expression had shifted slightly, the smirk fading. "Did you report these violations?" Julia pressed, sensing the shift in atmosphere. "I tried, but my concerns were brushed aside," Samuel replied, his voice gaining strength. "I was told that it was just the way things were done. If I didn't like it, I could leave." A murmur swept through the courtroom, and Julia could see Richard's jaw clenching, his facade beginning to crack. She pressed on, the momentum building. "And what happened to those projects?" "They often resulted in injuries, sometimes worse. The company would cover it up, but I knew the truth. I couldn't stay silent any longer," Samuel concluded, his voice growing stronger with each word. Julia turned to the jury, her heart pounding. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the testimony of a whistleblower. Someone who witnessed firsthand the negligence and exploitation that Richard Blackwell's empire thrives on. This isn't just about corporate greed, it's about lives at stake." As she stepped back, the judge turned to Richard's attorney, who stood up, ready to cross-examine. Julia felt the heat of his gaze as he approached the stand, a predatory glint in his eyes. "Mr. Jenkins, you claim to be a whistleblower, yet you left Blackwell Enterprises voluntarily. Doesn't that suggest you were complicit in the company's practices?" Samuel's face hardened. "I left because I couldn't be part of it any longer. Just because I stayed for a time doesn't mean I agreed with what was happening." "Interesting defense," the attorney scoffed. "But if you were truly concerned, why didn't you take your concerns to the authorities instead of leaving quietly?" "Because I feared for my job and my future. I couldn't risk being blacklisted in the industry," Samuel shot back, a fire igniting in his eyes. "But that doesn't absolve the company from its responsibilities." Julia felt a surge of pride for Samuel. He was standing his ground, and it was working. She could see the jury's expressions shifting as they absorbed his words. As the examination continued, Julia's thoughts drifted to her own past, specifically, to a devastating incident that had changed her life forever. It was a tragedy that she had buried deep, but now, as the trial unfolded, the pieces of her history began to surface. Her heart ached at the thought of the people affected by Richard's decisions, the lives shattered because of a corporation that valued profit over people. The testimony continued, but Julia struggled to focus. Would confronting Richard truly bring justice, or would it open old wounds? She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay present. The trial was about more than her personal vendetta. It was about holding a powerful man accountable for his actions. As the day wore on, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The tide had turned against Richard, and Julia felt a glimmer of hope. But just as she began to allow herself to believe in a favorable outcome, a shocking revelation came to light. "Your Honor, I would like to call Dr. Emily Carter to the stand," Richard's attorney announced unexpectedly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Julia's stomach dropped as Dr. Carter, a psychologist and an expert witness, took her place in the courtroom. She had treated Julia in the past, helping her navigate the emotional aftermath of the incident that had haunted her for years. Now, she sat under the harsh lights, a testament to the complexities of Julia's past. Richard's attorney wasted no time. "Dr. Carter, can you speak to the psychological impact of traumatic events on individuals?" "Yes, trauma can deeply affect a person's psyche, leading to long-term emotional distress," Dr. Carter replied, her gaze flicking toward Julia, who felt a chill run down her spine. "Is it not true that Miss Hart experienced a significant trauma during her college years?" Richard's attorney pressed, a smirk creeping onto his face as he watched Julia's reaction. "Yes, she experienced a loss that greatly impacted her," Dr. Carter confirmed, her tone clinical yet compassionate. Julia's heart raced. A flood of memories washed over her. Her childhood friend, the accident that had taken him away, and the guilt she felt for being unable to save him. She had buried those feelings, but now they resurfaced, threatening to overwhelm her. "Miss Hart has channeled her pain into this lawsuit, seeking revenge against Mr. Blackwell for her own trauma, correct?" Richard's attorney continued, each word a deliberate jab at her integrity. "Objection?" Julia's attorney interjected, but the damage was done. The jury was whispering amongst themselves, their expressions shifting once again. As the courtroom buzzed, Julia felt the walls closing in. She had always been driven by a desire for justice, but now, the line between revenge and healing blurred. She had come here to expose the truth, but what if the truth was that she was still the wounded girl from college, desperate for validation? The judge banged his gavel, silencing the room. "Let's keep this focused on the case at hand." Julia took a deep breath, reminding herself of her purpose. She had to confront Richard, to reclaim her narrative. She would not allow him to define her any longer. As the day came to a close, Julia felt a renewed sense of determination. She may have been vulnerable, but she was not broken. And as the courtroom emptied, she prepared herself for the ultimate confrontation. The moment she had waited for was drawing near, and she would be ready to face Richard Blackwell head-on, armed with the truth and her unwavering resolve. The courtroom buzzed with an electric tension as Julia Hart stood before the judge, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was thick with anticipation, and she could feel the weight of countless eyes upon her, each one filled with varying degrees of judgment and curiosity. She glanced at Richard Blackwell, who leaned casually against the witness stand, a veneer of confidence masking the turbulence beneath. He smirked, but Julia could see the flicker of worry in his eyes, a crack in his carefully constructed facade. "Your Honor," Julia began, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling within her. "Today, I present evidence that demonstrates the unethical practices of Blackwell Enterprises, a company that has thrived on the exploitation of the vulnerable." She gestured to the projector, and the screen flickered to life, displaying incriminating documents that detailed financial misconduct and labor violations. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, a ripple of disbelief spreading through the audience as they absorbed the implications of her words. Julia felt a surge of adrenaline. This was her moment. She moved to the center of the courtroom, her gaze locked on Richard. These documents prove that Mr. Blackwell knowingly engaged in practices that not only harmed his employees but also violated numerous labor laws, she asserted, her voice gaining strength. Richard's expression shifted, the smirk fading as Julia continued. "These violations are not mere oversights. They are a pattern of behavior designed to maximize profits at the expense of human dignity. We have witnesses ready to testify about the working conditions at Blackwell Enterprises, conditions that have led to countless injuries and even wrongful terminations." Richard shifted in his seat, his confidence clearly shaken. "Objection, Your Honor," he interjected, his tone laced with tension. "The witness statements are hearsay and irrelevant." "Your Honor," Julia countered, "these statements are pivotal in establishing a clear link between Mr. Blackwell's actions and the suffering of his employees. The court must hear these voices." The judge, a seasoned woman with a stern demeanor, regarded Richard with a raised eyebrow. "Sustained for now, Mr. Blackwell. However, Ms. Hart, proceed with caution. Ensure that your evidence is pertinent and admissible." Julia nodded, her mind racing as she prepared to unveil the next layer of her case. She had anticipated Richard's objections, but she was ready. "Let us begin with the testimony of Ms. Laura Jennings," she announced, calling her first witness to the stand. As Laura took her place, Julia felt a sense of solidarity. Laura had worked as a junior manager at Blackwell Enterprises and had bravely come forward to share her experiences. "Can you describe the environment at Blackwell Enterprises during your time there?" Julia asked, her voice calm yet commanding. Laura took a deep breath, her eyes flickering to Richard before focusing on the jury. "It was toxic," she replied, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "There was constant pressure to meet impossible targets, and anyone who spoke out about the conditions was either fired or blacklisted. I witnessed colleagues being treated like disposable commodities." The jury listened intently, and Julia could see their expressions shift from skepticism to empathy. She seized the moment to highlight the gravity of Laura's claims. "And how did this affect you and your colleagues?" Laura swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We were all terrified. People worked overtime without pay, and injuries were often ignored. I saw a man get injured on the job, and instead of helping him, the management just swept it under the rug." Julia pressed on, her heart racing as she felt the tide turning in her favor. "And did you ever report these incidents?" "I did," Laura replied, her voice gaining strength. "But it was futile. They had a system in place to silence dissent, and I was warned to keep my mouth shut if I wanted to keep my job." Julia turned back to Richard, who was now visibly agitated, shifting in his seat as he listened to the accusations. "Mr. Blackwell, you denied these allegations in your depositions. How do you respond to Ms. Jennings' testimony?" Richard straightened, his composure returning as he addressed the court. "I categorically deny these claims. They are fabrications designed to tarnish my reputation and that of my company," he asserted, his voice dripping with disdain. Julia felt a surge of determination. "You deny being aware of the conditions, yet you profited immensely while your employees suffered. How do you justify that?" Richard's expression hardened. "Business is business, Ms. Hart. If someone is unhappy, they can leave. I can't be responsible for every individual's experience." The courtroom erupted in whispers, and Julia sensed the momentum building in her favor. Just as she was about to deliver her final argument, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, drawing everyone's attention. A figure stepped forward, and Julia's heart sank as she recognized the unexpected guest. "Wait!" the woman exclaimed, her voice echoing through the hushed room. It was Sarah, Julia's estranged mother, someone she hadn't seen in years. Julia's mind raced, panic intertwining with disbelief. What was she doing here? "Your Honor, I have crucial information regarding the case," Sarah declared, her eyes darting between Julia and Richard. The judge looked surprised but intrigued. "Very well. Please take the stand." Julia's heart pounded in her chest as she watched her mother approach. Memories flooded her mind, memories of childhood, of laughter, and of the pain of abandonment. She had thought her mother was long gone from her life, a ghost of the past. Now here she stood, a wild card in a game Julia thought she had mastered. "Miss Hart, do you know this witness?" the judge asked, turning to Julia. "Yes, Your Honor. This is my mother," Julia replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The courtroom buzzed with renewed energy, and Julia felt the weight of her past crashing down on her. "Why are you here?" she demanded, her heart racing with a mix of anger and confusion. Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes glistening with tears. "I know things about Richard, things that could change everything," she said, her voice trembling. Julia felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "What do you mean?" "Richard is not who you think he is. He's connected to a dark part of our past," Sarah confessed, her voice breaking. Richard's face blanched, and for the first time, Julia saw genuine fear in his eyes. "That's irrelevant," he shouted, desperation seeping through his bravado. "No, it's not," Julia countered, her voice rising as the courtroom erupted into chaos. "What do you know, Mom? What's the connection?" Sarah hesitated, glancing at Richard, who was now sweating under the pressure. "I can't explain it all here, but I know that Richard was involved in something terrible when you were a child. It's why I left. I was trying to protect you." Julia recoiled, her mind spinning. The room felt as though it were closing in around her, and she struggled to catch her breath. "You left me to protect me from him?" she asked incredulously. "You never told me." "I had to keep you safe, Julia," Sarah pleaded, her voice cracking. You don't understand what he's capable of. The courtroom was in turmoil, the judge trying to restore order as whispers of shock and intrigue filled the air. Julia stood frozen, the weight of her mother's words crashing down on her. The very foundation of her quest for revenge began to tremble beneath her feet. Richard's smug demeanor had vanished, replaced by a raw vulnerability that sent chills down Julia's spine. "You're lying," he spat, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Sarah shot back, her voice filled with a mix of defiance and sorrow. "You can't hide from your past, Richard. It's time the truth came out." Julia felt a whirlwind of emotions: betrayal, confusion, anger, and a flicker of hope. The battle she had fought was no longer just about revenge. It was entwined with a deeper, darker history that threatened to unravel everything she thought she knew. As the chaos in the courtroom continued to swell, Julia's thoughts raced. Where did this leave her? What was the truth? The truth hung in the balance, a precarious thread connecting her past to Richard's empire, and she had to confront it. The stakes were higher than ever, and the battle was far from over. In that moment, Julia realized that the fight was no longer just about her. It was about uncovering the truth, reclaiming her identity, and finally facing the demons that had haunted her for so long. The courtroom fell silent, and all eyes were on her, awaiting her next move.